have just to say something because I am amazed about the fact that now bacteria is also involved even in your mood, not just the immune system, also neurological disorders, longevity, obesity. Every day there is a new paper and you can find more information. But I want to ask you all, do you think that this approach can change in the future the health of the population or even the medicine, the way in which we got a treatment or everything? Because I think that this can change dramatically the way in which we have a good health and we can take advantage of the bacteria, but also even in some contexts in which previously was not information at all, like neurological disorders or even like now longevity, your mood can be affected by bacteria. I think that is awesome, but I want to know your point of view about the future in the relation between medicine and health and bacteria.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think that this growing recognition that every aspect of our physiology and our function is related to gut bacteria, is going to, sort of in the coming decades, really change the way, we're practicing medicine and healthcare. And it's easy for me to imagine that in the future, we will be developing, really specific targeted probiotic therapies, so that, for a particular neurological disorder, maybe we'll discover there are a couple of essential strains of bacteria.
Of course,
I mean, I don't think that the probiotic industry is there at all. And at the present moment, I mean, I would say for most people, if you can eat a variety of live fermented foods, you're going to get much more microbial diversity than you're going to get from any probiotic capsule. But I certainly believe that in the future there might be some very specific targeted probiotic therapies that are developed for different specific conditions. So I think it's really going to change the way that we're practicing medicine. And I mean, I already have a sort of a little bit of sort of an anecdotal idea that some doctors are becoming some doctors and also some patients in what they're asking of doctors. They're where maybe a couple of decades ago everybody wanted antibiotics for everything. People are a little bit more reluctant to take antibiotics because they know that it can upset the bacterial balance that's so important. So, I mean, I certainly am not against antibiotics. I would never tell anybody, not to consider them. But I think that we need to be very, judicious about their use and, not use them every time, somebody, has a stuffed nose or something.
Do you think there's something on this discovery of bacterial fermentation that can solve some of the very damaged aspects of the food system, or maybe changing it? You work with local growers and all that.
Well, I guess what I would say is that really what we need to do to challenge the centralized industrial food system, the system of food mass production, is to get more people involved in smaller scale food production and creating more, alternatives. And so, most of the work that I do is, about just teaching people simple techniques to ferment things at home. And I recognize that, not everybody wants to ferment at home. And I've also actually seen a huge explosion. Certainly where I live in the US, but, in my limited visits to, Latin America America. Like in Ecuador, I met people who had kraut businesses and kombucha businesses. In Costa Rica, I met a Japanese Costa Rican family with a miso and Japanese pickle business. I think that, it's just small, local, and regional business enterprises are something we have to support and encourage. And in something like fermentation arts, it's really ideal. It's not really possible for, one individual household to, brew beer, make wine, make beer, make sauerkraut. It's just not, it's great to feel empowered that you can do these things yourself, but it's not realistic that everybody is going to make everything for themselves. So, I think that supporting small local businesses is really important, not only in fermentation. Just in, buying vegetables and buying grains and everything. So I think that, the single biggest thing that people can do is to dismantle the system of food mass production by creating alternatives, whether that's, growing a garden for themselves, doing some fermentation for themselves, supporting a local farmer's market, supporting a local farm. There's so many different ways that people can do this, but, it's basically we have to, build a parallel food economy. There will certainly always be people who want to sort of buy the cheapest thing that's available, but we have to, make sure that we're developing alternatives for that as more and more people, sort of wake up to the shortcomings and problems with that system.
I have one last question because I want to know your point of view about what do you think that fermented food represent for cookers or chefs, and on the other side for consumers or the general population, people that, for instance, never attend to a course that Maximo used to do, the different point of view.
Sure. Well, for chefs, fermentation represents all of the most compelling flavors known to humanity. I don't think there's a restaurant anywhere in the world that's not using products of fermentation, even if it's, vinegar and soy sauce. But these are kind of, essential components of flavor. And then you get into, I would just say if you walk into a gourmet food store, anywhere in the world, most of what you're going to see is products of fermentation, just because fermentation creates the most compelling flavors. So it makes sense to me that, any chef who is sort of, interested in, creating compelling food for people, would want to play around with some fermentation themselves and make some, signature flavors, some really unique things. But even if they're not doing that, they're still, working with products of fermentation that somebody else has created in order to make those flavors. And let me just talk for a second about texture, because, I think in addition to flavor, fermentation creates all these like really interesting textures. Think about like like soft cheese or something like that. Or if you've ever tried Japanese natto, where the soybeans get really, so I think that that's another really exciting way that chefs can work with fermentation just to make distinctive, different kinds of textures in their food to play with people's palates. In terms of consumers, you mentioned earlier this idea that people get interested in fermentation for lots of different reasons, and this has absolutely been my experience. So chefs, chefs and people who love to cook, they might be motivated primarily by flavor and the idea that fermentation creates these incredibly strong flavors, and maybe they're not thinking about health at all. And then people who are really like they're very concerned about their health, their children's health, their partner's health. And maybe they're interested in flavor, but that's not their primary interest. They want to learn about what's the benefit of these foods, where can I find them, how do I use them, how do I make them. And then, I mean, in the United States, I meet a lot of immigrants from other places. So, people from Eastern Europe, people from Africa, people from different places in Asia. But, people who come from places where fermentation is a really important part of what happens in people's kitchens, and who, in their migration, they've lost that, and they want to, sort of find their way back to sort of embracing the culture that they came from. So I meet a lot of people like that. I've met, a handful of young Native American people who are interested in reviving their cultures and interested in really like cultural survival issues. And I think that, fermentation is a set of practices that is, kind of central to culture. And,
Yes.
I think that, for people sort of, struggling for their cultural tradition to sort of, survive into the 21st century, this is one of the ways that they're, sort of trying to, restore their cultures by reviving their fermentation practices. I've just been eating some Ramps sauerkraut, and Ramps is a sort of a wild cousin of onions and garlic.
Wow.
And this Cherokee friend of mine brought me like this big bucket of Ramps. I'd never seen so much of them in one place, and we made sauerkraut out of it. We made Ramps sauerkraut. It's one of the most delicious sauerkrauts ever. So I'm not sure if that was traditional to his people, but it's it's a way of I would say that in contemporary fermentation, there's a lot of taking traditional processes. Let's say, so if sauerkraut is traditional with cabbage, you can do it with any vegetable and applying it to other kinds of foods. So, I'm hoping that he'll go back and sort of start, using that as a way to preserve this incredible, food resource that they have a lot of available. So, people get interested in fermentation, I would say, for lots of different reasons. And to me, that's one of the interesting things about it, that not everyone is, after the same thing.
Fantastic.
Bueno, Sandor, my English is bad, así que voy a tener...
Better than my Spanish.
Okay. Bueno, nada, primero que sepas que para nosotros, acá en Crudo tenemos un grupo de seguidores y sos como una especie de James Brown para nosotros de la fermentación.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the translation.
The James Brown of fermentation.
Y que, habemos un grupo de amigos, de periodistas, entre ellos está Tomás Lynch. También tenemos otro gran fermentador que es Alex von Foster. Todos colaboraron en hacer algunas preguntas. Y bueno, estamos muy contentos de que estés acá en Crudo con nosotros, esta congregación, digamos. De las preguntas que tenemos es, durante las clases muchas veces la gente pregunta sobre los riesgos, si tiene riesgos la fermentación.
In class, usually students ask if there are any risks on fermentation.
Oh, so you want my answer to that? I would say, as long as you're working with, when you're working with raw plant material, there is no risk.
Okay.
There are if you want to make salami, you certainly can do it safely, but you need to understand the parameters for doing it safely. Since you're a vegan cooking school, you're not really dealing with the fermentations that are risky. In Alaska right now, most of the botulism in North America is coming from Alaska, and it's basically native people taking traditional methods for fermenting fish. And then instead of lining their pits with like pine needles and grasses, they're using plastic and creating this perfect anaerobic environment that allows the botulism to grow. So sure, in certain cases when you're dealing with meat or fish or even cooked beans or milk, there have been cases of problems. But when you're working with raw plant material, I would say that there's no danger. And, sure, I mean, you could make wine and it could go off. It could turn into vinegar instead of wine, but I don't consider that a danger. That's. But I would say that I continually try to tell people that fermenting raw plant material is very, very safe, and really all plants have lactic acid bacteria, and except in the case of very sugary things where yeast will dominate, lactic acid bacteria will always dominate.